Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 46 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm back here today with Curt and Jerry, and we're going to continue our discussion from episode 45 on trauma and fixed mindsets, but shift our conversation today around the Carol Dweck's concept of growth mindset. So you'll probably be okay if you didn't listen to the last one to jump right in here, but we'll try to sum it up a little bit. But if you find this interesting early on and haven't watched episode 45, you might want to jump back to that one. So today, again, we're going to talk about the powerful research Carol Dweck and others have been doing and explore how the relationship with growth mindset and trauma, how we sort of see that as often a good step to recovery for folks as well. Like most episodes, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week, and I'll let Curt start this week to see if he's got one ready for us. Curt, you got anything on your mind this week?
Well, I think it was last episode, maybe a couple of episodes, I gave a hello to my niece, Aubrey, and now I'm in trouble, so I have to say hi, Max. Got to equal it out.
Good. Well done.
So bright shiny object is certainly family. I've just got a great one, and they are such a great support and so much fun to be around. So I wanted to say hi to them and how much I appreciate them.
Very cool. Very cool. Jerry, what are you thinking about?
What am I thinking about? Well, I'm thinking about summertime, and as Matt, you can kind of identify, this is kind of the last week my wife gets to stay home for the summer and gets going back to school. So I want to kind of think about the summertime as my bright, shiny object, and time to kind of reconnect with my wife before she goes back and gets stressed.
I won't say that's already begun at my house, but yeah, I think Sarah's going back on Wednesday. So yeah, things start to change around the Bennett household as well. So
really, all of those teachers around the country to kind of try to keep that summertime mindset.
Exactly. So we'll see how that goes. But I'll just besides Sarah and Summer and all that stuff, I want to throw out a really good podcast series that I believe wrapped up, and it's Matthew Gladwell's Revisionist History. This round is the season, I guess you call it, with him, because he gets all kinds of production value and all that in it, unlike us. But he talked about memory and the sort of flow of memory, how memory changes over time, and really uses some, if you know Matthew Gladwell's work at all, he always tells his stuff through great stories. And if you haven't listened to his podcast, there's some really great stuff that I think, well, he doesn't talk specifically about trauma. We can really connect a lot of it to our work and traumatic memories as well. So if you haven't listened, if you haven't ever gotten anything from Matthew Gladwell, my suggestion is read everything you can of his. But his podcast is also really great as well. So just a plug for that. Maybe Matthew will plug us at some point as well. So we'll see if he reciprocates the offer. So, but and Matthew Gladwell was kind of a good lead into this topic, because one of the things he made famous, and you'll see this number anytime you get to a specific number and you say this is the number. Other scientists seem to not like that it's that concrete, but Matthew Gladwell was one of the researchers, or at least presented some of the research to build off Carol Dweck's work with the growth mindset. And his mention of what he found in the research was that we need about 10,000 hours work on something to become an expert at it. And that really fit in well with Carol Dweck's growth mindset, where she says people thrive when we see ourselves as the product of our work. So the harder we work at something to build expertise, the better we get at things, which is sort of obvious, but it's those people that sort of can get out of that growth or that fixed mindset we talked about really thrive. So I want to just add another kind of example of my journey towards this and the fixed mindset. And that was, I was doing this exercise I mentioned last time. And it was that exercise I want people to think about. And when we talked about how none of us like the word victim mindset. But a lot of times with trauma, there is this shame, lack of self-worth, this feeling of being judged, which again, all really reminded me of Carol Dweck's description of that sort of fixed mindset thinking. And if we're in that fixed mindset thinking, we often don't look at ways to improve ourselves and our situation. And then at the same time, I wanted to help people think about, okay, what do you see when you see that survivor's mindset of when somebody starts to, in some ways, become bigger than their traumatic past, where in that fixed or victim's mindset, a lot of times the trauma seems to have power over them. And as they shift into that survivor mindset, they start to gain control of their own life and decisions and those sort of things again. But I did, as much as I hate the word victim, I didn't really like the word survivor to describe this either. And, you know, when Carol talks about her growth mindset, you know, when we're in this mindset, she says we're really focused on improvement. So we're looking for areas of our life where, and this may not be something that we spend, you know, years and years developing, but we look for little areas to grow personally and professionally. What she found with people that are looking for this and groups that are looking for this is that they have increased motivation and resiliency in the face of hardships, and they really take responsibility for the outcomes in their life. And again, this is such a different way of thinking than that fixed mindset, which again, without a better word, also kind of felt like the victim mindset as well. And so when I was thinking about this, one of the things that came to mind is I was working with Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a model that I use in a lot of my trainings, is that traditionally what we've seen in cultures, and Joseph Campbell does a great setting this up, and The Hero with 1,000 Faces is his book that kind of made this all famous, is that the hero chooses to go on a journey. And that journey, as any great story has, it has trauma involved in it. I like to say, if you want to see somebody tell a story with trauma, just go see any Disney movie. It's right there, and it usually happens pretty quick in the movie as well. And so there's trauma happen, then there's pain and suffering, and usually the hero ends up in this abyss, as Joseph Campbell calls it. And we've talked a lot about this throughout the podcast of, I like to say, kind of a disconnection from self, others, and spirit. There's this real darkness that takes over. And then this mentor, which is, for a lot of the listeners that we have, is sort of our role, that we come in and we find this person in a really dark situation. And for the first time in a long time, whether it's the folks that we work with, or whether it's these great mythological creatures in our stories, they start to see hope for a better life. That's really, in many ways, the role of the mentor, is to find hope and help the hero recognize again that they can make that better future. And one of the things that when I started to think about this, one of the things that I really see the growth mindset, maybe not a survivor mindset, but really that hero mindset, that I'm looking for ways to get out of my pain and despair, and knowing that I have some power to really overcome that. And so one of the things Carol challenges us to do as people, but I think is also important in our work with those struggling with trauma, is when they're in that kind of fixed mindset, when they're judging, when they're beating themselves up, help people to show that they do have, and Curt, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, that they do have control over their situation. And I know this is kind of a much more complex thing than it sounds at times, but that they can start to have power in the life that they're living. And I just kind of wanted to get some of your thoughts, again, from your perspective, about that aspect of control and seeing themselves as something that they can, if they work hard enough, they have a real power to change their life situation.
If we back up to how we even define trauma, one of the aspects of traumatic experience is that it's an experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope, and that normally it's characterized by a pattern of unpredictability and extreme intensity. So when an individual goes through experiences like that, it creates an experience in which there is no control. It's a loss of control. And so that can easily, from what we know, could lead to what we'd call a fixed mindset. I would go back to kind of the last episode where we talked about habits and how habits get formed and how they're really useful shortcuts. And our brains is designed to want to move things into habitual action so that we don't have to think about everything. We don't have to use our frontal cortex for everything. That's very metabolically and energetically taxing. So habits get formed that way. When we think about what generates resilience, it's a different pattern of stimulation. And the difference all the way back to what creates tolerance and what creates sensitivity. The pattern of the stressor is different, and that the pattern becomes, it's predictable and it's at a level that we can overcome it, that we can handle the experience, that our bodies can handle it and our brains can handle it. So that's a key part of the recovery process. And because something has happened earlier in life that generated this habitual way of thinking about the world and of handling the world, that as we could say, it creates beliefs about the world, right? That going through those experiences creates a template for us to view the world through, that the repetitions required to go the other way are a lot to overcome that. And so we have to go through it over and over and over and over again. But that is doable. Yeah. One of our jobs as treatment providers is to arrange environments so that happens. And so that it happens predictably and reliably. That's what I was thinking while you were.
Yeah. So I'm interested in your thoughts, and then I'd love to get Jerry's thoughts on your thoughts. Is that sense of, I think what I see in Carol's research and others is that there's a sense that I have power and control over my life, over my outcomes. In some ways, I guess we would say over my environment. And I wonder, kind of as you think about, because I know a lot of times, and again, you've taught me so much more about behavioralism than I've known, but you know, it's so much when I've worked with behavioral folks in the past has been really the focus is more on creating an environment that changes the behaviors, not as much sort of that in the skin piece of having the person gain control over their own behaviors or, you know, find some power in their own environment. And with older people, like people experiencing homelessness, for example, that they can make different choices that allows them to maybe get back in the work environment, seek mental health services and those sort of things.
Well, the two are correlated with one another. So one can come before the other. You can change your behavior as a function of the environment and gain different ways of thinking. You can also change the way you think that can change your behavior. As we talked about last time, contingency-shaped behavior versus rule-governed behavior. They can both get you to the same point. They're just different pathways to get there. So it's not that one means that the other one isn't relevant. They both are. And you can get there in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's too much to go through the rule-governed behavior first. It might be too difficult, and you have to go the contingency-shaped route. Other times you can you can get things done that way. I mean, a good cognitive intervention where you're changing the way somebody thinks about a situation or doing reframing, that's really efficient. You can get things done really quick that way. And if that changes behavior, great. That is a really nice, efficient way to do it. But there are lots of situations where that intervention isn't the right intervention given the circumstances. And then you need different things in your toolbox to be able to draw from to help to change that person's environment and the way that they function within it.
Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I had a lot of thoughts. Curt did a nice job of kind of defining trauma. And I think that there's a very big difference between somebody who has a really solid relational health early in life and then runs into some dilemma in life later on and goes on a hero's quest. Yeah. But if you remember in the hero's quest, when the hero leaves, usually there's someone giving him a choice between staying and leaving.
Yeah. So the blue pill or the red pill is the one.
There's a connection. There's already a connection that happens, right? And when you look at some works, say from Richie Davidson, who kind of looks at this left brain mode kind of way of thinking about seeing problems and approaching them, as opposed to being in a defensive state. More right brain. You'll look at the work of Marty Tesha, who kind of looks at people who are traumatized have asymmetric and more activation on the right side of the brain than the left side of the brain. In a way, there's the environment that kind of activates certain behavior, but we're not a stimulus response creatures. We make meaning of the environment. And the way we make meaning of the environment has a lot to do with how our nervous system reacts to those stimulus that are there. And so I think individuals who've had experiences being in a place that is highly activating, but have had people show up for them to help them to manage that. Develop an internal narrative that even though things are bad, they're going to get better. Mm-hmm. And that either I have the internal resources to figure out how to do that, or I have access to other resources that are going to help me do that, right? And for many of our clients, we look at the current situation, but really when we look at it from a historical perspective in their lives, there are people who've had the ACEs studies began to talk about early exposure to overwhelming experiences that were repetitive. So when you hear Curt talk about the pattern of activation, is some of our clients have had not only severe, but chronic exposure to high levels of stress that they've had to figure out how to cope with. And that when those exposures happen during a developmentally sensitive period, it begins to change brain structure to kind of looking at that, right? And so if we think about it that way, then we have to kind of go back in the context of our relationships with people and not necessarily talk about this cognitive narrative of growth mindset or not, but how do we create a kind of felt sense experience that they feel that they're being exposed to manageable levels of stress in a predictable way in the relationship with us. Mm-hmm. That allows them to begin to experience some sense of that this is manageable, right? And so in a way, what we do in our relationships is go back and in some ways recalibrate their nervous systems, right? And we do that in the context of our relationship, or we do that by creating certain environmental changes for them that they're in a place in which they can manage things, to kind of looking at that until they could develop the capacity to. So in a way, you could think about Curt's thought, and you could think about yours, is that we replicate the hero's journey when we meet with them, mm-hmm. Yeah. Right? we're providing some level of co-regulation. We're validating and connecting. And so when they meet with us or when they encounter things and they have us, we're providing them some level of understanding. We're providing them, they're borrowing our kind of cortical capacities until they develop their own cortical capacities. So it starts with us having the growth mindset. Then it allows our clients to develop the growth mindset. Right? So the mentor holds that biological capacity is the more mature, better regulated nervous system that allows the client or those on that journey, as you would kind of define it, to be able to use us, to be able to kind of have an experience where there's a reparative experience. So, you know, I think that as we learn about these kinds of impacts on our clients, and we look at it at a genetic level, at a neurobiological level, at an affective level, at a cognitive level, and then at a behavioral level, the more levels that we could see it, the more lens we have to really see our clients. Right? So it's really about what we've been trying to do on the podcast is present different lenses to really begin to understand that we're basically social creatures that require the environment to provide us certain, in some ways, expected experiences that allows our nervous system to activate to a kind of optimal level. And when that does, the result of that is we begin to experience some sense of control, some sense of positive outlook, some sense of hope, that we begin to generate those states in ourselves, right? We begin to have self-regulation as opposed to depending on other things. So, you know, I think Curt really kind of highlighted that you can have the environment providing some of that, and then we have the capacity to generate that internally as well by the way we think. But we all start out needing some external kinds of experiences to build in those capacities. Look at it. We're not born with those capacities.
I think there's a nice area of overlap between the ideas of a sense of control and the way that environment behavior interactions work. And this is one of those areas where I think we, as non-behavioral versus behavioral, right? If we say behavioral versus the world, there's an area here where I think that we think we disagree, but I don't think that we do. I think we're just using a different word to describe it. So one of the things, if we go back to, we've talked a lot about what generates an unhealthy way of dealing with the world, right? So we've talked a lot about the impact of adverse childhood experiences, how that constrains the way that there's a certain amount of behavioral variability that starts to get constrained with adverse childhood experiences. So kids start to explore less. We get into, in Carol Dweck's world, fixed mindsets instead of growth mindsets. But the other side of that coin is what happens when it goes well, right? And you get a child that will explore the world. And one of the key experiences that a child has, and adults have this too, is that when I'm interacting with my world and I can see and detect that I cause a change in that environment, that experience in and of itself releases dopamine in my brain, in the reward circuits of my brain. It functions as a reinforcer. And that's very behavioral. Yeah. We often don't think of it that way, right? And what that gives me in terms of an emotional experience is a sense of control. And so there's a behavioral effect, and there's also a correlative emotional effect. And one of the things that comes from this comes right from Skinner's view of behavior analysis, is that both of those things are correlated with one another. Neither is less important or more important than the other. And they both are events that require explanation and analysis and exploration. And that is where one of those kind of areas where we think we disagree, but I really don't think we disagree. One of us was talking about the internal experience or the correlative emotional experience of causing a change in the environment and watching that change happen. Right? How many times can you think back on experiences where you did something just to see if you could do it or not? Mm-hmm. Right? That's a very powerful experience in the life of a human being, and especially a child. And the more of those things that they have, the more a sense of control that they have. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the areas where we see what is healthy attachment and what is healthy development. It gives you a very strong sense of, I can be effective within this environment. And that's really healthy. And then that allows us to explore. That's what we would call a secure attachment base. We put a lot of different words onto that experience. And I think it's vital to the health of a human being.
So, I love where this conversation is going, because this word popped into my head, I think from probably my undergrad history of psychology course way back 20 years ago now. But this concept of locus of control, like this ability. And I used to think as, again, someone lucky enough to come from a family where I did have a secure attachment. For me, I always kind of thought of that as the little voice in my head that would tell me if I was doing something bad, the little voice would tell me, hey, you're doing something bad. But then I asked the kids, I was working again in the juvenile justice arena. I was like, well, what's that little voice in your head telling you what to do? And they're like, it's telling me to kill you right now. I'm like, oh, our voices are different. Like, my internal reality is not their internal reality. Like, I stopped asking what their voice was telling them to do, because it was not pleasant to try to sleep at night afterwards. But I kind of wonder, like, am I hearing right, Jerry? Let me throw this to you, and Curt, I want to get you on this as well. Is that locus of control really is what we're saying comes out of relationships, whereas I think we look at it a lot of times as this individualized internal thing. But can we look at that maybe as a skill that's developed through that relational process?
So we're born, right? We're born with certain almost expectations of what we're going to find in the world when we're born, right? We're going to find somebody who's going to connect with us, right? So, and when they connect with us, they activate certain biological processes that we have the potential to do that, right? So we have the capacity for symbolic representation. We have the capacity for making sounds. But we're not born with the capacity for speaking English or speaking Spanish or speaking Mandarin, right? We need some experience to activate those capacities in us, to kind of looking at that, right? And so in those early relational interactions, there are certain circuits that are being activated and certain circuits that are not being activated, right? And one of them is this capacity, as Curt would say, is to feel like we have some control and power over our world, right? So I smile, my caretaker smiles. I cry, my caretaker responds to my state to kind of do it. I begin to be in a bi-directional interaction. So the infant begins to have an impact on the caregiver, and the caregiver has an impact on the infant, right? It's bi-directional. So when you engage in certain, if you want to say behaviors, those behaviors are activating certain emotional states. Those emotional states are creating some type of chemical change that are activating and strengthening certain neural circuitries, right? So that it is occurring at multiple levels that we tend to become experts in and look at one level, but really it's occurring at multiple levels, right? So that what we're beginning to say is that these interactional processes begin to in some ways create maps of our world. And those maps later on have narratives that go with them, right? And so you can begin to think about these mindsets as some map that got created, a symbolic representation and an explanation for why things happen in the world, right? And so, in a way, if I grew up in an environment where I begin to have the world respond to me and I respond back to it, I begin to develop some sense of what you would describe as a locus of control. Mm-hmm. But if I did this today and nothing happened, and I did the same thing tomorrow and something happened, and I did something again and nothing, I would begin to think that it's not contingent on my behavior. It's something's happening out there and I'm just reacting to it. I develop a different sense of locus of control. So these are all being recorded based on your starting this at an implicit level when we're very young and very, right? It doesn't mean we can't have experiences to change that, but it's very difficult to change those mental models that get created at a nonverbal level, right? It takes a lot of repetition, a lot of experience, where if I already have this mental model that I'm in control of things, I'm going to approach the world in a different way. So my behavior is going to be different, and I'm going to get different results, and I'm going to interpret experiences differently, right? But if I already believe that I'm out of control, I'm going to interpret experiences and see certain, right, different foregrounds are going to jump out, and I'm going to look for ways to reinforce what I already believe in the world, unless something happens to begin to have some pattern repetition to change that experience for me.
Yeah. And I love, boy, yeah, I think
going with Curt smiling, saying,
like the birth, like,
right?
look at what we did.
So when we become experts in it, well, I'm a cognitive psychologist or I'm a neuroscientist, we look at these issues at different levels of examining them. But we're not just the brain, and we're not just our behavior, and we're not just our emotion. We're integrated, and they work in some ways in unison to begin to help us create meaning to our experience.
Yeah, and I think if we, let's bring as what you said, Jerry, and I think if we bring trauma into that childhood experience, when at least my conclusion that I came up with was that the mindset we often see with trauma is at least highly related to what Carol Dweck is talking about with that fixed mindset of always being judged, always being somewhat inherently not good enough. Again, those are our mental maps, if I'm hearing you right, are sort of crafted around, well, if somebody treats me like this, I must be this kind of thing. Is that this is such a powerful message, and I design maps around that, probably somewhat for survival, especially if their trauma is repeated. But also, it's just that's I'm developing my narrative, my story, my map around those probably some of the most intense experiences in my life. And then we encounter, maybe even years after the traumas stopped, maybe in some instances, we still see that map being the dominant way they look out at the world and at themselves.
Think about what you said, and then I'll let Curt, because I want to hear what he has to say. But think about what you said about your client. You approach a situation and you have an internal narrative that in some ways that narrative makes you select certain behaviors to respond to the environment, right? Mm-hmm. Right? To kind of do. Where your client is in the same situation and they have different internal dialogue going on. So based on their dialogue, they're going to select a different set of behaviors to respond to the same situation as you are.
Yeah.
Right? And we can kind of look at that as that you could say, okay, let's look at that behavior and let's work on it. Mm-hmm. Or let's look at that narrative. But really, that narrative is in some ways connected to the nervous system's response to the environment that's activating these circuits. So in a way, these are really interesting discussions about, is it behavior, is it affect, is it nerve? It's all of the above.
Yeah.
Right? It's all of the above. We're integrated creatures. And so really what we try to do is present different lenses to some of these each week. But it's up to us to understand, is the person sitting in front of us, their biology is reacting at all levels. That's why this is so complex.
Yeah.
That our brains are self-organizing, which means that we're all talking, but our biology is interpreting, experiencing things differently.
Yeah. Curt, what are your thoughts?
I'm thinking about a non-trauma example of a fixed mindset. And it's an area where I have a fixed mindset. And it comes from an experience in my teenage years, which you can imagine how embarrassing this was, right? So I'm at a big group, we're having like a picnic or something in a big park. And there was this little kind of cinder block wall, maybe 3 feet high. And I'm walking along with like 3 or 4 of my friends. And we all kind of look at that wall, and you can imagine what we're all thinking, right? Like we all had a growth mindset about that wall. I can get over it. And so we all kind of like do a 3-step kind of jog to jump over this wall. And 2 of my friends stopped before they got over the wall. I did not. And my back foot just caught the very edge of that wall, and down I went, right?
Yeah.
Tons of like teenage girls around, like, look, I'm totally embarrassed. I am not likely to go jumping over walls at a picnic now.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting, right? That's an area where, right, there's a sweet spot for a growth mindset.
Yeah.
I mean, ask Evel Knievel when he crashed, like, why did I think I could do that, right? That's a growth mindset. That's a very strong growth mindset. Should have been a little bit more fixed. All right, so and my buddy who didn't jump looked at me down on the ground. He's like, man, I thought for a second that was going to happen, so I didn't do it.
Yeah.
So that's a great, I think, a good example of how now, like the way I think about that situation changes how I would behave in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I would need a lot of support and a lot of coaching and a lot of changing how I think about things, and probably have to go through repeated experiences of hopping over that wall successfully in that context before I would think anything different about ever doing that again.
Yeah.
And so that, for me, I was kind of thinking about that as an example of how those kind of maps and schemes that we can put onto the world get generated by one small experiences, and then they can last for a long, long time. I still remember that, and I was like, 12 when that happened, and it would take. It's not hard to imagine what kind of experiences I would need to go through now as an adult to change that experience, right? I've never changed that memory, but I would have to have a completely different experience multiple times in order to start having more of a growth mindset about walls at picnics when there are lots of people around. That's something, and there's a correlation there between I would have to have a successful experience and experience the reward of having a successful experience, and that over time could change the way that I thought and I felt in that context. Yeah. So both things are kind of happening simultaneously. That there's, as Jerry said, right, there's how we define the problem often leads to some of the disagreements that we might have across disciplines, is that really we're defining problems differently, and we're using different levels of analysis to kind of solve the problem.
Yeah.
So all of those things are happening at the same time in that kind of benign experience. And now, to kind of pull it back to a trauma example, now think about, have that experience been something where I was really unsafe, where I was really being harmed, and how much greater of strength or salience of that memory, and how much greater impact on my daily existence would that experience have, had it not been something as benign as hopping over a 3-foot wall at a picnic, right? That's a pretty benign experience. And the people that we interact with have experiences that are 1,000 times stronger than that, and have them repeatedly and chronically.
Yeah. Great example. The one thing, Curt, let me throw this to you at first because I'm wondering from your perspective. One of the things that this conversation is also bringing out when we talk about that growth mindset, the belief that we can sort of improve ourselves and that shift of thinking. Another thing that popped into my head as we were talking is the power of choice in our environment. And there's been some really fascinating research studies. I think I love the simple studies, the ones that I can really understand in 5 minutes. And a couple of these I saw done at nursing home environments. And like they gave one group a choice of when they ate lunch. Another study was whether or not they wanted to water their own plants. So these really simple choices. And what struck me about both of these studies is the group that had this small choice kind of started not dying. they lived. So like on the first floor, everybody's kind of dying at their normal rate. And all of a sudden this group that were watering their own plants and they had that choice, which was always a choice they had. They were just told they had a choice. Their health outcomes started to change dramatically. And so there's been some really cool studies about this. I just kind of wonder, as we're trying to help people see themselves as something that they can improve, they can work on, their future could be different than the struggles of their past. How do you, when you think about those environments that you try to create, where does choice and thinking about strategically giving people as much choice or awareness of choice as possible? I'd love to hear your thinking on that, because it seems like that sort of environment would promote a growth mindset and be maybe some initial steps for somebody that may have been in that fixed mindset for maybe their entire life.
Yeah. I mean, first I would go back to what we were talking about earlier of how the experience of engaging in some behavior, whether that be overt behavior, even it can be covert behavior, it can be thinking, and that results in some positive change in the environment, and you get to see that happen, is incredibly rewarding and is incredibly health promoting. Mm-hmm. That is a healthy biological system that has that experience. And especially true, I think, in our complex brains that always put a story to things, that is designed to do that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important that story gets generated from that perspective. Yeah. And I'll kind of switch this over to how often I kind of see that start to go wrong in a lot of environments. And well, I'll give you a link to this article if people want to read it. Not everybody loves it because it's a mathematical modeling view of behavior, which I think is just fascinating that we can be that predictive about what happens. But basically, this article talks about that every situation is a choice situation, right? Because you can always do behavior A or anything else. Yeah. So it can be viewed as a choice between A or anything else can be B. And so designing our environments with that in mind is really helpful. And what starts to happen when people engage in quote unquote behavior treatment, right, is that we start to decrease the number of options in order to change behavior A, right? That if behavior A is reinforced by some frequency of reinforcing event, right, then we should reduce the frequency of that reinforcing event in order to stop behavior A from happening. But in this kind of modeling equation, what that results in, the prediction that results in, is that if you reduce the overall amount of rewarding experience or positive experience available, behavior A is likely to go up, even if you reduce that specific rewarding experience. So you could actually reduce the frequency of this problem behavior by increasing the overall amount of rewarding experience available. And that is one of the things that I see go wrong so frequently, as trying to reduce the one behavior and the reinforcing event that is at least puted to be the maintaining reinforcer. And you could also do it probably more effectively by increasing the overall amount of positive experience available. And that's kind of like, jumping into a larger pool, you make a larger, smaller relative splash, right? Like that you can actually change things that way. So I'm happy to share that that are, again, not everybody loves that one. I love it.
But I get emails from the nerds like us out there. So let me, because this is something I saw Jerry do. And I wish everybody could get a chance to see Jerry at work with a dysregulated child. Like, it is one of the more beautiful things I've ever seen professionally in my entire life. And one of the things because I wanted to learn how to do what Jerry did. When he would this kid was ready to, just trash an entire facility, and Jerry could come in and just, in his Jerry kind of way, get the kid to calm down and laugh. And one of the things as I paid attention to Jerry, what you did was you sort of gave the kid, no matter what situation the kid was in, that you did a lot of things, but one was kind of that they had a choice in the situation. And I want to jump to Jerry, but Curt, before we do, I would like to ask you is, one of my big thinkings, especially with MI, we call it the menu of options, where I think a lot of times especially when you're in poverty, when you're in a facility, the number of choices you have drops realistically really dramatically. And so I think a lot of times people, especially in systems of care, feel like they don't have any choice. I think that classrooms can feel like that at times. You got to do this or punished sort of thing. And so, I strategically, as I learned motivational interviewing and other approaches, really made sure the rule was to give them 3 options, because if we don't, we usually give them the option we want them to do and the option we don't want them to do, and trying to do that. But I wonder, like, when you kind of construct these environments or these interventions, does allowing the person, whether it's a child or an adult, understand they have a choice? Is that an important part of your thinking?
It is, and there are stages of that. And I mean, it's one of the, I think, great negotiating tactics to give 2 options when there's a lot more than 2.
Yeah.
and sometimes that's too much for, especially that I've found, sometimes that's too much for a child to handle.
Yeah.
Like, more than 2 options gets to be a little bit much. So sometimes you're giving some structure around constraining those. And other times you want to highlight that there are more than 2 options, and that it isn't just I do this or I do that there are other things out there to do. And the more you can do that, the more options that somebody has to actually allocate their behavior to, that gives them a nice way of interacting with their environment, and that the symptoms don't have to get generated. There's other options for them to do.
Yeah. Great. Jerry, what are your thoughts? I know this is something I picked up on your interventions, and almost your crisis management when you would walk into these situations, and just kind of wondered what you're thinking of. Did you agree that, like, choice can help people sort of see that they have that locus of control, or whatever we want to call it? And then how have you used that clinically in your work?
So, you ask a really complex question, so I kind of, right?
First one, though. First one ever.
I'm having 2 thoughts, so let me answer your question. But I'm also wondering how this discussion today is impacting your thoughts about your hero's journey. So I want to kind of get back to you to kind of talk a little bit about that. But to me, the issue of choice is not my first level of intervention. I see dysregulated behavior as a communication that what I'm feeling inside is too big and too much for me, right? And so when I enter a situation, my first attempt is not to give a choice, is to try to give a sense that I get your communication, right? I hear you feel you're treated unfairly. I hear you feel that somebody didn't pay attention to you, or somebody did something to hurt you, or is that I try to, in some ways, 1 is resonate with their state, and 2 is to communicate that I think I'm getting their communication, right? Is that so often what happens is people come to a situation and try to manage their behavior, right? And their behavior is their attempt to kind of want to control what they're feeling, but also communicate. So if you're managing their behavior, you're missing the communication.
Yeah.
So the first thing I try to do is really resonate with them, manage my own state, right? When I walk in there, I'm going to manage, but also I'm getting what you're feeling. And once they feel heard, seen, heard, and valued, and I say it 100 million times on this, but that allows them to now start to move to a state where they start to engage with me. Right? As opposed to trying to manage their state, now they've moved to a place where they're engaged with me. Even if they're saying, I really want to do this and I really want to do this, they're now starting to move out of that place where they're being overwhelmed, and now they're starting actually to use words and communicate with me. Right? When they're in that state, now I begin to have this kind of bi-directional process that goes on. And eventually, then I can get them to then say, what are the choices they have? But when they're in that dysregulated state, it isn't about choice. It's about trying to manage, right, this overwhelming experience. So there's, in my mind, I have to be really clear about what my goal is when I enter that situation, right? I think when you deal with young people sometimes, they don't know they have it. Their locus control is, I think I got to keep this kid quiet because it's going to annoy everybody else.
Yeah.
Or I think I've got to do this consequences because that's the rules that I'm supposed to follow. Or I've got to pull this technique off the shelf in order to kind of get this result, right? Really what we want is somebody to show up and be present and communicate that I get what you're feeling, right? That's really what I kind of do. So in a way, if we think about, the Dr. Perry's model of regulate, relate, then reason, is my first attempt always is to be a co-regulator. Then that person, I allow them, when they're regulated, they engage. Now I can be connected and engaged, and then they can reason.
Yeah.
So instead of me thinking I'm moving them to reason, I let them move through their process, get to where they need to be to kind of do it. And my job really is to match what they need.
Yeah.
So that's really what went through my mind to kind of manage that. And it had a lot to do with doing this for years. I was very rarely threatened by what was going on with my clients, whether it be a dissociative state that I've seen before, whether it be about rage that I think is really important part of the healing process, is I was comfortable dealing with those states, right? And I didn't have all the constraints of I'm supposed to keep the milieu quiet. It's like that wasn't really in my mind that I kind of look at to kind of do it. So I think that really all the things we're talking about today is when the environment matches your biological needs, people seem to be able to make better use of the available resource.
Yeah, great.
So that's your answer to your question. I wonder if you take a moment and think about how all this is impacting your understanding of your hero's journey.
Well, I mean, in many ways, and to bring that quote we used last time of Carol Dweck is the growth mindset is based on a belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through your efforts. And I see that lost. And again, none of us like the victim mindset terminology, but in some ways it is descriptive of that abyss that Campbell talks about is, I'm just overwhelmed by trauma, my life situation, everything that's happened to me. And I think what I think the beauty of the model is then even these strong people that we look at, like Luke Skywalker or Hercules, at the darkest point of their journey, they need someone's help to come in and help them probably regulate, relate, and help them kind of see and see the hope but also, you know, in MI, we call it self-efficacy, which is just kind of it's almost too of a cold term for this, in my opinion, but that they have some power and control to make their future different than their past experience. And so, you know, what this does, and this discussion has done really well, is the complexity of this for people, especially with complex trauma, is that the fixed mindset, or at least the characteristics of the fixed mindset, depending on when you come into this person's life, it may be 6 years old, it may be 60 years old, has become, like Jerry, you said, their map of the world. And sometimes that map is what I think Campbell calls the abyss, is the world's a dangerous place where people are out to hurt you. And just all the things that need to come in, variables come into place to help people see that they have some power to change the outcomes of their future. As Jerry, you said, shows the just the tremendous complexity of our work. And this is always the tricky thing for me, is you find that with one person, and the person you see next is going to probably need a whole different, again, there's going to be some commonalities, but you have a whole different experience in neurobiology you're working with for your next client, the other student in your class, so on and so forth. So as I always say, nothing that if you have me come in for a training, you're not going to think your work's any easier than you thought it was before you had me come in. I hopefully will give you some skills and some ways to think about it, but I think it's important to understand that complexity too.
It's hard to remain flexible all the time, right?
well, and I think that's the reminder for us again, is, you know, we have to keep that flexibility in our own work, in our, you know, and I think both of you mentioned this in different ways, our own growth mindset. If we, and this is where I really get worried about people with self-care, is if we get too cynical or rigid, we lose any kind of effectiveness that we have to have that flexibility to relate to people, like Jerry said, where they are on the spectrum. And, you know, as one of the things I almost wish, you know, we could call Curt something different, because behavioralism, it's more innovation, I think, of when I hear you talk. It's, okay, we've got this issue, and how do we solve it a lot of times by using the in-skin and out-of-skin stuff. So I think it's a really exciting thing to take this piece of research and bring it down under the trauma-informed lens. So, yeah. Any other last thoughts before we sign off for this week?
The last thing I was thinking about, something that Carol Dweck says a lot, and I think it is just great, about praising effort.
Yeah.
And that's an important change, I think. And in the behavioral world, we call that shaping.
Yeah.
That's what we call that process. And I think that's something to just kind of keep in our heads, is to praise effort.
Absolutely.
You know, I think that people at all levels, whether it's their behavior, whether it's their emotions, whether it's their neurobiology or physiology, have the capacity for change.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that when we believe that people have the capacity for change, that creates a growth mindset in us. When we begin to get despair and hopeless about a particular client or the state of the world, we move out of that state, right? And so I think it's really both a trauma-informed organization really creates a sense of having people have a voice, having people have a choice, having people feel in some ways that we could solve this problem collaboratively. All of those principles support growth mindsets.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think if we take anything out, we could think about our own hero's journey, and that how can we be open to saying that we can grow and we can change. And when we stay in that state, we can be a resource for our clients.
Absolutely.
As opposed to having our clients organize our experience, we can be in a place to help organize theirs. So that's how I'd like to kind of end today.
Absolutely. And it goes back to that concept, Jerry. I know you and I talked a lot, that learning organization of, hey, we are a product of our continued focus and cultivation of our expertise over time. And if you think you've arrived, we've got books for you to read. So, and you can find a lot of those books at traumainformedlens.org. We'll throw the links in there. I also put another book in there that I basically, it's my gift to all the people in my life that are having kids. It's called Nurture Shock. And I thought they did a really great job of looking at the growth mindset from a parenting and really early education perspective as well. So I'll throw a link to that in there. And then we have a great, coming up next week, we got a fun month coming up, actually. We have a new friend of mine, Dr. Allison Sampson Jackson, joining us next week to talk about trauma and resiliency. She's was a fellow keynote speaker at a conference I did in Iowa, and so I'm excited to have her. So join us next week. We'll kind of continue. If you haven't gone back and listened to our past episode on resiliency, you might want to see that one. That was still one of my favorite ones, and we'll continue that with Dr. Sampson Jackson next week. So Jerry, Curt, thank you guys so much. Again, check everything out at traumainformedlens.org and have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.